something a little bit different. Lately, the language of the national emergency has been trending on social media, and I wanted to go back and clarify some of the things that I had said about the national emergency in my last couple of audios. So let's start from the very beginning. Back on March 13th of 2020, Donald Trump proclaims that we are in fact in a national emergency. And one thing you might want to take a look at in the language of the actual original proclamation is that he gave authority to the Secretary of Health and Human Services to undermine HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act privacy rule, for Medicare, Medicaid, and state children's health insurance programs. So that's something you might want to think about. And if he gave the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which was at the time Alex Azar, if he gave him authority to do this, then what other sorts of authority has been given to the Secretary of Health and Human Services? Without veering too far off the subject of the national emergency, I would encourage you to look at the Health Services Act of 1944, which was basically updated in 1983 to include language of giving the Secretary of Health and Human Services more power for quarantining, forced inoculation, power over individuals, that kind of thing. All right, so again, on March 13th of 2020, the national emergency was declared in the United States. It was the original proclamation. So we went, let's go a year later. Here we are a year later on February 24th, 2021, the continuation of the national emergency concerning the coronavirus disease. And in this continuation, you can see that Joe Biden didn't really have much to say. It's basically a continuation of Donald Trump's original proclamation from March 13th of 2020, but he says that he will be publishing it in the Federal Register and transmitted to the Congress. All right, so that was February 24th, 2021, about a year after March 13th of 2020. So let's move on into February 18th of 2022. That's this year, because right now the date is November 17th, 2022. And again, he continues the national emergency for the coronavirus disease pandemic. He continues this national emergency and says once again that this notice shall be published in the Federal Register and transmitted to the Congress. He makes good on his word because on the very same day, on February 18th of 2022, he writes a letter to the Speaker of the House and President of the Senate on the continuation of the national emergency. So he does what he said he was going to do. He writes the letter. He says, I have already sent to the Federal Register for publication the enclosed notice. Now, why is this important? The Federal Register is going into the presidential archives. So this is an official presidential document. You notice that it's dated the same date as the continuation of the national emergency and the letter that was written to basically Nancy Pelosi. And it's officially now stamped into the official presidential archives, into the White House National Archives. It's officially stamped that we are, in fact, in a national emergency due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's official as of February 18th of 2022. And so we are now in a national emergency with no end in sight. In accordance with Section 202D of the National Emergencies Act, which is in the National Archives here, which talks about, the extension of the COVID emergency, he includes this code here. So what is this code? This code is under the title of War and National Defense. So right there is your first clue, your very first clue, that it went from being a health emergency to some kind of National Defense Emergency Proclamation. And this is why it's continuing. Why would you put a health crisis under something like war and national defense? Ask yourself that question. Think about what's going on geopolitically right now. Think about what just happened in Poland yesterday or today. Okay, think about that. And again, this is November 17th, 2022. I'm just archiving history in the age of COVID, which is a term or a phrase that I used a lot back in 2020. We're archiving history in the age of COVID. So we have this code that it's embedded into the continuation of the national emergency. It is now in the National Archives, and it has to do with war and national defense. And in the language of the war and national defense, whenever you have a national emergency declared, it clearly states that a joint resolution in reference to congressional committees, in the event of a disagreement, the filing of the report, the termination procedure is deemed part of the rules for the House and the Senate. So basically what that means is that whenever there is any kind of national emergency declared, the only way to end it is if there is a joint resolution where Congress comes together and votes on whether to continue the national emergency or whether to end it. They did this with 9/11, and they also, and I don't believe they ever passed any kind of resolution to end the national emergency under terrorism. So we are still under a national emergency for terrorism. All right. So the Joint Resolution Committee came together, and what was their vote? Sorry, guys. Right here. The joint resolution passed. They passed the vote. They said, yes, we want to end the national emergency. So the Joint Resolution Committee got together under SJ Res 63, which was, shall we end the national emergency? And most of the people who represent or are supposed to represent us in Congress voted yes. Let's end this national emergency. Let's end it now. What is the President of the United States' response to Congress saying, let's end the national emergency? Well, right here, if Congress passes this resolution, the President will veto it. Same day, a memo written by the Executive Office of the President under Office of Management and Budget, same day comes out and saying, that's nice, Congress. I'm so glad that you guys came together and got over your differences, Republicans and Democrats, and voted to end the national emergency for the COVID fraud, but I'm going to go ahead and veto it. And Reuters also did an article on the same day saying that Biden would veto the proposed resolution to end the COVID national emergency. You've got individuals like Nina Turner saying voting to end the COVID-19 emergency declaration means 15 million Americans lose Medicaid and CHIP benefits, a reduction in food benefits, and restricting telehealth visits. No, we shouldn't do that. The emergency declaration is not about COVID restrictions. It's budgetary. She's right, but she's also wrong. I would argue that there is no way that millions of Americans will lose their Medicaid or their CHIP benefits. They will not see a reduction in food benefits, and none of their telehealth visits will be restricted if we end the national emergency. I would argue that these safety nets and these benefits would continue. It's very hard now because we do know that within a national emergency, within a declaration of a national emergency, a revenue stream is opened up to various regions and to various states and communities and counties. So in a way she's right, but in a way she's wrong. So where does that revenue stream sort of like begin? Well, it begins with this idea that a health emergency actually exists. So we have on October 13th of 2022, Javier Becerra, who is the Secretary of the Health and Human Services, declaring to the United States in general, because he's been given the power to do so under the Public Health Services Act, declaring, yep, we're a really sick country. Ooh, we're so sick. So a health emergency truly does exist. With that in mind, how is that revenue stream that I talked about, how is that handled? Like, how is that managed, that revenue stream that comes down into your states and into your counties and into your cities and into your local municipalities? If we're in a national emergency, like Biden officially stated in the National Archives, then where's the money going to go? Who's in charge of it? And like Nina said, she's very concerned that these benefits will end. They won't, but there is some revenue stream coming. Who's in charge of it? What's going on? Well, the HHS is in charge of everything. Javier Becerra, the Secretary of Health, like I mentioned before in many podcasts before and many audio messages before, he's in charge of everything. Let's take a look at something that I stumbled upon. Back in April of 2022, President Biden announces key regional appointments for Health and Human Services. So today, President Biden appointed the following individuals to serve in key regional leadership roles. These are appointees. They were not voted in. These are the people that are in charge of your various regions. We have Region 3, Region 4, and Region 5. You can look up Alice Stanford, and you can look up Region 3, and you can find out if your state is part of Region 3. These appointees are what take that revenue stream, because we are currently under a national emergency, as declared in the National Archives. It's very official. These are the people that are now in charge of allocating the funding to the various regions. In this particular statement and release on whitehouse.gov, which you yourself can go to, I'm not the only one that knows how to use a keyboard and a mouse. You guys certainly have access to the internet too. But in this particular statement, Janine Boyd is in charge of Region 5. And they happen to mention in this particular statement what Region 5 is. And look at that. Region 5 serves Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. Well, that sounds a lot like an interstate compact, right? Which is something we talked about in our video essay called Deconstruction, which you can go to our YouTube channel and you can find Deconstruction. Janine Boyd. So when you are concerned about the continuation of a national emergency, what are some of the things that you might be concerned about? Well, you would probably be concerned about quarantine and isolation statutes. For instance, we learned back in March of 2020, when the original national emergency was declared, that we had to close our schools, close down our businesses. We couldn't go to the dentist. We couldn't go to the doctor. We couldn't get the services we needed. We couldn't even get together and have birthday parties or even go to the beach. Remember all of that? What these appointees dictate is that they can continue for this region, depending on which region that they are, that they have been appointed to lead, because they're the leadership now of this region. Again, unelected people that are in charge of your various regions, they can make those same declarations. They can say, okay, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin, I, Janine Boyd, as your HHS regional director, will dictate to your local health authorities that you need to quarantine, that you need to close down your businesses, that you need to isolate, that you need to shut down schools and put all the kids on tablets, that you can't get together, or that you need to, in order to have access to goods and services and public accommodations, you need to show proof of a vaccine. Whatever it is that Janine decides for those 5 states that I mentioned is what goes. One of the things that concerns me is that Janine is also in charge of state quarantine and isolation statutes. Again, an unelected individual who operates outside of constitutional law, who we did not vote into office, suddenly has more power than you, more power than your governor. And so she would be in charge of 5 states listed under these quarantine and isolation statutes. And you can find your state and find out what the penalty is for violating quarantine and isolation by going to this website under the National Conference of State Legislators, which was updated in September of 2021, so about a year ago. All of this it's starting to sound less and less like a health emergency and more like martial law, isn't it? It's starting to sound more like something that countries that have been taken over by bad actors would insist on the people who occupy those countries, or the people who live in those countries would insist that they follow new rules. The bad guys have entered your country and are now taking over. So who's the bad guy? Who are the bad guys that are taking over and turning this into more of a, sort of like a coup of our life, rather than treating it like a health emergency? Well, the bad guys that are in charge of this whole thing from the very, very beginning, and who ultimately pressured Donald Trump to make this declaration and make this proclamation, who pressured Joe Biden to continue the national emergency forever and ever and ever, in fact, document it in the National Archives officially. The people who also have, the same kind of individuals or outfit that would declare any national defense strategy, whether it was to help with a domestic terrorist situation like we were told we had in 9/11, or I guess at this point it's like a health crisis. Who are those people? Well, they are, and I'm sure you can already guess, they are the Department of Defense. The U.S. Department of Defense, we were the ones who basically took over the country with FEMA, Department of Homeland Security, and Department of Health and Human Services, and the State Department. So every big faction of the U.S. government has taken over the COVID response. And so the Department of Defense works with subcontractors, works with their defense contractors in order to create countermeasures or prototypes. And those countermeasures and prototypes were labeled and marketed by the media as COVID-19 vaccines. So this is what's going on, is the Department of Defense is treating its own citizens like we are terrorists. And everything that I just laid out for you in this short audio is an explanation of that. Here's a document here. It's very dry. It's just a Word document. It's from the Department of Defense, and it talks about the determination of existing declared emergencies, which basically summarizes what I have just said. So any national emergency declared by the president shall be terminated on the date specified in any joint resolution. Okay, and that's where we had the Joint Resolution Committee come together, and they passed the SJ's Res 63, which is to end the national emergency. And so that even by the Department of Defense's own language, it should end. But they've gone back to the president and said, yeah, not so fast. We're going to need you to continue the national emergency because it benefits us. We are the ones in charge. So it looks like we have a coup taking place as we mentioned a lot, but this is actually the breakdown of it through proclamations, continuations of that proclamation of the 1 year later, then 2 years later, then an actual letter saying, yeah, I'm really serious. Okay, fine, we're going to make it permanent. Here we go. It's in the National Archives. It has to do with war and national defense. We are apparently at war, and so we need to be under a national emergency right now. We've got, in tandem with this, we've got the HHS and their unlimited scope of power announcing that, yes, in fact, we are a very sick country, that a health emergency does exist. Therefore, we need to appoint various leaders throughout the various regions who are unelected, who will have control over these big clumps of the United States, and let them know whether they need to quarantine or isolate, or you can close down schools or close down businesses, or incarcerate yourself, put leg irons on your ankles and put chains over your face. You've got people like Nina Turner saying, oh, but wait, it's a revenue stream and we really need to continue these, benefits for these people. And so we really shouldn't close down the national emergency. We should continue the emergency declaration so that these poor people can get Medicaid. I would argue that these people will still have access to Medicaid whether we have a national emergency or not, because they did before, but it's clear that Nina Turner is in service to not this joint resolution committee that passed on behalf of the American people that we need to be free again, but she is in fact in alignment with Biden, who says he will veto it, and she is, in fact, in alignment with the Department of Defense, who has announced very clearly through these other transaction authorities, which I'll be talking about in my war crimes video essay that will be coming up, and through EUAs, that all human rights are suspended under these transactional authorities and under emergency use authorization. Okay, so I hope that that has brought some clarity to the situation. I wanted to explain that we are, in fact, in a national emergency, and that the best way to get out of it, I think, would be to address your region's health and human services appointee, not an elected official, and suggest to them that they rethink their position, and that you undo the statutes of quarantine and isolation, which sound a lot like martial law. Okay, have a great day. Thanks. Bye.